Well, today I'm joined by the Reverend Dr. Tim Perry, who I will just refer to as Tim, but Tim's the lead pastor at St. Paul's Lutheran Church in Steinbeck, Manitoba. Tim, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
I've really been looking forward to it, and we are going to break all the rules of polite conversation today because we're going to be talking about religion and politics. Nothing could possibly go wrong, and I'm sure the comments will be nothing but unified and everyone getting along. I'm looking forward to this.
Well, we'll see how it goes.
Oh no, this is going to be great. Um, but Tim, you've recently written a book called "When Politics Becomes Heresy." It's a fantastic book. It'll be linked in the description down below. But I want to start with just kind of an observation, and that's that evangelicals specifically are increasingly being referred to as a voting bloc, perhaps even more than they're being referred to as kind of a religious movement. How did we get here?
I think it's been a long journey. And I guess the first thing I'd want to notice is that while that's certainly true in the United States, it's not true in other countries in the Anglosphere. So, like Australia, the UK, or Canada. My own country, Canada, um, there are basically five parties that try to send people to the House of Commons. Of those, three dominate, and you'll find evangelicals more or less supporting any of those. So we're not a voting bloc, and I think in the UK, evangelicals tend to be well to the left of evangelicals in the United States in particular, and they're by no means a voting bloc. You'd find evangelicals who vote Tory, evangelicals who vote Labour, and I think that's true for other countries in the Anglosphere as well. So um, it seems to be entirely that way simply because of the cultural influence of the states and the size of the evangelical community in the states. I think for those two reasons, but it's not true globally. Um, I think certainly someone like Mark Knoll would be better to comment on the evolution in the states than I am. But I think the shift really begins um, in the 70s with the rise of Jerry Falwell and the moral majority, um, and other factors as well. And it wasn't exclusively a Republican phenomenon at the beginning either. Uh, the first widely celebrated evangelical president was Jimmy Carter, for example. And there's a very famous picture of Jimmy Carter and Larry Norman sitting on the White House lawn listening to Jesus music during his presidency. So, uh, but from that time through the 80s, it's shifted more and more towards one party over the other. And there are all kinds of reasons for that, some that are understandable, some to me that are less so. But it's been a long journey for evangelicals in the States, and well, we are where we are, I guess.
So that's really helpful, and I'm curious as you were writing this book and reflecting on kind of the state of political discourse within Christian circles, and it seems particularly within evangelical circles. To what extent did you have the kind of uniquely American expression of evangelicalism in mind, and to what extent did you have kind of the broader, just English-speaking evangelicalism in mind?
I was thinking particularly of uh, the two countries with which I'm most familiar, and that's Canada and the U.S. Um, Certainly, it's the case that the degree and the severity of the polarization in your country is not as bad here. But the trends, I think, are moving in the same direction simply because of the size and scope of your cultural influence. It's long been a joke in Canada that we sleep next door to an elephant and we have to kind of watch out when you roll over, and that's not an insult at all. It's just, we're a tenth of the population, 90% of which lives within 100 miles of a border. Um, so your influence on our country is going to be huge, and so that kind of polarization is coming north, though it's not quite as pronounced, at least yet. So I was writing with both our countries in view, and what I saw was as kind of a disturbing trend amongst Christian communities that I grew up in, that I'm most familiar with, mirroring the wider popular culture in which having the right politics has replaced religion as the transcendent good in the popular culture.
That's a really important point there. The idea of having the right politics transcending having the right religion, and that it's becoming the transcendent thing there. And so I'm curious, what does this kind of hyper politicization tell us about the state of evangelicalism? Is it simply the case that kind of evangelicalism has stayed steady, but the importance of politics has kind of leapt up, or are we seeing a erosion of kind of the religiosity of evangelicalism, if you will? So yeah, what's going on with evangelicalism that we find ourselves here?
Uh, I don't want to say that's above my pay grade. Um, I I really don't know what's specifically has led to this. I speculate a little bit in the book that it has to do with uh, a really strong desire to have a place at the cultural and political table that has been growing in evangelicalism for a long time. Joseph Bottom wrote about it from a Catholic perspective years ago in the pages of First Things, and he expressed hope in a couple of essays in that journal that a combination or a cohort of evangelicals and Catholics could replace liberal Protestantism as kind of the conscience of the nation, and and that's not necessarily a bad thing. But I think that it's that noble ideal that's become kind of the hyper politicized uh, culture, even within the our churches that we're talking about today. It's moved from it's basically, I think it's an attempt to answer the question, uh, now that we've earned our place at the table, what do we do when the table is no longer an obviously Christian one,
Hmm.
right? So the mainline denominations, the United Methodists, the PCUSA, in Canada, the United Church, the Anglican Church, um, they could very well act as the conscience of the nation when the nation's common popular culture was largely Christian, and the common popular culture basically reinforced Christian mores, Christian worldview, and so on. As the influence of those denominations has waned, evangelical influence has grown, but the culture has not remained static. The culture has moved, I think, in a decidedly post and sometimes even anti-Christian direction. And so you have the question, perhaps, what do we do now that we're here, but the culture is so different from what it used to be? And one very strong voice is to double down, retrench, do the things that got us to the table in the first place. And I think I think that sadly has led to a mirroring of the culture and making our politics the most important thing about us. And as I try to say in the book, Jesus and his resurrection from the dead should be the most important thing about us, and we work out our politics from there.
Yeah, it seems that today we're living in an interesting moment, at least here in the US, where that desire that I forget the man's name, but that wrote in First Things, is maybe somewhat happening. I mean, we've got a vice president tweeting about the Ordo Amoris. We've got more kind of evangelicals in power than we might have anticipated, say, 15 years ago. But yet, I think there's a growing wonder of not just, okay, so what do we do when we get to the table and it's less Christian, right? But what are we willing to give up to get to that table? And it seems like part of what you're saying there is we're willing to kind of put politics in the front seat, in the driver's seat, if you will, of what's most important to us. And I guess my question here is, what's the solution to this kind of quagmire of how we put religion and politics together? Because on the one side, I think people will say, let's just keep those two things really far apart. Let's not, never betwixt shall they meet, right? That we keep religion on the one side of the room, politics on the other, and we just kind of operate in two tracks. But I think what we've seen is a lot of people feeling like that ends up just ceding all of the ground to people who aren't religious. And so now people have wanted to really fuse those two things to gain power for people who are religious, but maybe with some unsavory consequences of that. So what's the answer? Do we keep them apart? Do we fuse them together? How do we have kind of a faithful Christian political witness?
I think, it begins by recognizing that politics is a good thing, that it is part of the common grace that God extends to all people everywhere. That the ordering of our lives together, which is what politics um, is God ordained, God approved human function. So it's a good, uh, and as a result, Christians cannot and should not forsake it. Even the forsaking of it is a political act. So politics is a good, but it's not the good. And so I mean, if you want to make a criticism of the book, it's kind of short on the solutions that you're asking for, but that's on purpose. Um, Beyond recognizing the secondary goodness of our political life and participating in the ordering of our life together in the wider society, I don't have a whole lot to say about that. The book really is um, it's an invitation for people to join me in repenting of making politics the most important thing. I'm reminded here of a quote. I don't think I included it in the book, but and this is not a quote, but it's a paraphrase as best as I can remember. It's from C.S. Lewis's The Four Loves. He says, when a good becomes a god, it becomes a demon. Uh, and so I think that for all kinds of reasons, um, many Christians have found themselves, like me, tempted to make this secondary good a god, and as a result have become enslaved to it. And the solution to that is not political. The solution to that is repentance. Um, so this book is not a programmatic book. Here's what evangelicals have done wrong, and here's a third way. It's more like somewhere along the lines, we've done some stuff really wrong. I have done some stuff really wrong, perhaps for perfectly understandable reasons, and I need to repent. And I'm pretty sure I'm not alone in that need.
I'm pretty sure you're not. And I think a whole lot of us are in that boat. You do it in a very particular way, though. You choose to use this idea of heresy as something of a way of recognizing what's going on in us that we might need to repent of, or what we might need to avoid, a kind of lens through which to look at our political discourse. At least that's the way I'm interpreting it. Feel free to push back on that. But there's a lot of ways of maybe taking an inventory of, hey, am I making this good thing a god? Why did you choose to use this idea of heresy being applied to politics to help us see what's happening?
Um, well, I mean, the main reason is that I think it's a really illuminative way to frame the issue. And the one kind of thread that ties the various heresies together, at least after the first one, which is Simony. You might want to talk about that in a minute. I don't know. But the thread that ties the various heresies together is uh, both their uh, leaders and their followers, if you want, were Christians. And so I wanted to all the way through the book kind of emphasize that in some way or other, this is us. And this is what happens when things go off the rails. And so I try to present various heretics as opposed to heresies in as sympathetic a light as possible. So I think you think the Gnostics, for example, are desperately wrong, but they're desperately wrong because they want to be relevant in their culture. Uh, well, boy, that sounds um, a lot of the church growth seminars that I used to go to when I was first starting out in ministry, and it was all about, how to be relevant to the culture. Well, that's not a new thing, and that's not a peculiarly evangelical thing. The Gnostics were the first who were all in for relevance, and going on, going on from there. If we present, I think, the heresies accurately, fairly, and the heretics in as sympathetic a light as possible, we begin to see, I think, how some of the things that we're doing are mirrored in what has come before. And so I found it to be a kind of a helpful way to frame the issue.
I did too. I found it to be a really interesting read, and as someone with a theological background, it was fun to be able to map these ideas onto what we might be seeing in the political sphere. So I really enjoyed it. I think the people who watch these kinds of videos will enjoy it as well. Before we get into Simony, which I want to get into next, because I think what you do there is really important in the way that it kind of connects to the downstream heresies, I want to make sure that we're on the same page with this idea of heresy. I loved you
Sure.
included kind of a little anecdote in the book that in your college days, heresy just meant like anyone who believed something outside of the mainstream. And I remember, when I went to Moody Bible Institute for my undergrad, and we just kind of throw around the word heresy with such looseness and freeness for just anyone who we thought was wrong. It was like just the easiest way to have a hot take on anything was just to call it heresy, and it was probably irresponsible and definitely not theologically nuanced, let's say. So, what do you mean by heresy when you're using this term?
Uh, I really like the definition that the Catechism of the Catholic Church gives. It's a post-baptismal, stubborn embrace of a doctrine the Church rejects. Uh, and I think that's kind of works all the way through.
Yeah. Okay. So let's start applying that. Let's start with simony. How do so? What is simony first, and then how do we see that in the political sphere?
So Simony, the name comes from Simon the magician in the Book of Acts, the famous convert who tried to buy the Holy Spirit and was rebuked by Saint Peter for doing so. Um, Outside the Book of Acts, Simon, in early Christian writings, kind of takes on the life of the culture's first supervillain. He was the arch foe of Saint Peter, and they kind of followed twin tracks to Rome. And Simon would deceive people with his uh, works of power, one of which was apparently riding around on a magic carpet. Um, and From that biblical description, Simony came to name a peculiar ecclesiastical crime, especially in the Middle Ages, which involved buying or selling church offices to ensure political power. So, you'd have a very wealthy family, say, in a city state in Italy, who would bribe the right cardinals and bishops to ensure that their son would be made a bishop at the age of 12, for example. And it was done entirely for, political, powerful, influential reasons. So that's what simony is, and it became a crime, quite a serious crime in the Middle Ages, um, such that when Dante wrote the Inferno, and we get to, I think it's Canto 19, um, uh, the Simoniacs, the church leaders who were guilty of the crime of simony, they're the only ones that uh, Dante really has nothing good to say about. Like there's no reason for sympathy or pity for them. They're just they're in hell. They deserve it, and they, whatever they get is well earned in terms of their divine punishment. Um, so translating that to today, and this maybe feeds back on your earlier question. I worry that within me, at least, there is sometimes a desire to maintain uh, social political privilege, perhaps for really understandable reasons, but at the cost of the gospel. And that I've called a peculiarly contemporary version of simony. The dynamic now is not, you know, a wealthy, politically active family buying a church office. Now it's um, uh, Christian leaders wanting desperately to purchase influence, I think, by uh, giving away, moderating, remaining silent about um, members of their team uh, whose positions are, I think, opposed to gospel witness.
That's helpful. I think something that I want to drill down on here maybe a little bit is whenever we talk about things like this, and especially using a term like simony, it might be really easy to say, well, that's not me, right? I mean, I'm not buying any church offices, but I'm also not this significant Christian leader who has any ties to, significant political figures. But I think what you're doing in this book is saying, like, this doesn't just apply to, insert whatever big name person who has, a big platform or what have you, but it applies to me, you, everyday Christians. So without kind of, I'm not asking you to like call anyone out here, right? But how might we see this in ourselves if we struggle to recognize it in ourselves? If we're saying like, yeah, I'm just Joe Schmo church attender. This couldn't possibly
Yeah,
be me.
yeah. Well, first, I mean, the first thing to say is to go back to the introduction and the conclusion of the book. Is that before I'm calling anyone else out, and I'm really not comfortable with that language, so I understand why it gets used. This is about me, right? And I certainly don't have uh, a big following at all, but I have my own political convictions, and those convictions are going to be tested by going to the ballot box here in Canada, probably at the end of next month. It's expected that the new prime minister will call in a general election as early as Sunday, this coming Sunday. So I have those convictions, and the question is, am I tempted to say nothing when the party that shares many of those convictions, the MP who represents that party that I will probably cast my vote for, am I tempted to be quiet when part of that party's platform is fundamentally opposed to the gospel? Right. So am I willing to exchange my silence on issue X because the party ably represents me in A, B, and C, right? So there's, I guess what I'm inviting people to do is Christians to do is to recognize that we'll always be outsiders and we can't be full on team players for any one team as a result, because our kingdom is not from this world.
That's helpful. And just to press into this a little more, I, I'm genuinely curious about how to manage attention here. And that is, on the one hand, I think it's very tempting for, and I see this in myself, so I'll speak as you do here, right? Like I see in myself a temptation to want to be silent on certain issues where it's just kind of like politically or socially expedient to be silent on them, right? Um, on the other hand, I think we live in a time that is uh, peculiarly kind of interested in this idea or bought into the idea that like my opinions really matter and I need to tell everyone them. Especially as someone who has a YouTube channel, right? I
Right.
get the temptation to be like, well, I need to make my views on everything known because the fact that people will react to it must mean that my views are important, which it really doesn't mean, right? Like people don't need my hot takes on every issue or my unsolicited advice on everything. So how do we manage that tension of making, not being unfaithfully silent when we ought not to be, but also not feeling like we do need to opine on everything just because we can?
Yeah, and that's the new social media reality, right? And I am glad for uh, people like you um, on a higher profile, people like Bishop Robert Barron or Sean McDowell or whomever, who have pretty large social media followings. Um, and I'm thankful for the work that they do. And you know, I am amazed and impressed at the way that Bishop Barron, in particular, manages to avoid these kinds of political pitfalls. He talks a lot about the culture of contempt and the way in which social media seems to be deliberately constructed to invite us to have contempt for people with whom we disagree and then to share it because um, the algorithm knows that saying nasty things gets more clicks than saying nice things, and so it's going to play up those clips. So and so gets owned after 5 seconds with whomever, right? That kind of stuff. That's what people want to click on. That's what people want to see. So the people who are gifted with vocations and ministries like yours who manage to avoid the culture of contempt, I think they're kind of the people to watch and to treat as examples. For me, the easiest thing is to stay off social media as much as possible. So I have a Facebook account. Um, if you scroll back, you will find that up until relatively recently, the last couple of years, uh, I don't think I was politically rude, but I was politically engaged. And I just came to the point where, for myself, I had to avoid the medium, and when I was on, I had to do not political stuff. So my my last post was linking to a video of Joe Rogan listening to Larry Norman, for example. Um, uh, so I had to really limit my social media involvement to avoid doing that. Um, I do think some of the disciplines that the spiritual disciplines that I talk about in the book, like cultivating prudence, for example. Uh, strengthens us against both an unhelpful quietism and a more unhelpful um, shout it from the mountaintops. Uh, because it invites us to stop, take a breath. Do I really need to record on this? Do I really need to send this? Is this what the gospel requires of me right now? I think all of us who have some kind of public Christian presence need to be asking those questions pretty forcefully all the time.
I think you're absolutely right because it's so easy to fall into just chasing what works, right? And a culture of
Oh yeah.
contempt works. And I think, especially as media becomes people's livelihood, or even just if it's not their livelihood, if it's their main sense of self-importance, right, is having, if that's tied to having some type of audience, then people are drawn towards doing whatever works to get eyeballs on their content and to get people having opinions and commenting and liking and sharing or whatever it might be, right? And it can be a really slippery slope because what works is not always and not often the things that promote the virtues and growth and holiness, right? It's often kind of catering to our lowest base instincts because it's that like animalistic reaction that we can elicit from people that is
Oh,
often the most
absolutely.
strong. So I think that it's
Yeah.
really good advice, and I think it might tie into the next heresy, that of Gnosticism. But I'll allow you to make that connection more fully. But you call out Gnosticism as another kind of political heresy that's going on, and you already connected this to some of like the church growth movements that you've seen at different parts in your life, which to me seems again like this culture of pragmatism. But how does that show up in our politics? This idea of Gnosticism.
Yeah. Gnosticism, I, it's really easy to write the Gnostics off because the particulars of their beliefs just sound so bizarre to us. You know, placing the reality of the spiritual world ahead of the reality of the material world, for example, such that bodies are not so much evil, but they're gross, they're dirty, and we want to leave them behind when we die. We don't want to be reincarnated again in a material body. Um, unless we've grown up in a Hindu or Buddhist culture, that sounds pretty foreign to us. But the Gnostics were not unique in espousing that. That was just part and parcel of the world in which they lived. Um, and they wanted uh, to bring Jesus into that world. Jesus was the liberator who really would deliver you from the prison house of the body. Uh, and in that sense, they were acting evangelically in the sense that they wanted to bring Jesus to their culture. And they were doing so apologetically. They wanted, not in the sense of apologizing, but in the sense of defending the faith. They wanted to do it in a way that would disarm many common pagan objections to Christian faith. In both of those things, they were wanting to be relevant. And the nub of their heresy, I think, is not their particular convictions about the base nature of the material world. It's rather the more general conviction that the most important thing was to be relevant to the culture, and that overarching desire to be relevant led to a loss of purchase on the gospel. They ended up becoming so culturally relevant that the gospel no longer called people to conversion because the gospel was just another mystery religion like the Mithras cult or whatever that had lots of adherents in the ancient world. And so people could look at it and say, oh, okay, well, if that works for you, great, and move on. Um, so it not like all the heresies in the book, right? The problem ultimately is the loss of purchase on the gospel. And Gnosticism, like the other heresies, they lose purchase on the gospel for the legitimate desire to speak a message that is understandable to their world. And the problem is their desire to be understandable eventually led to the eclipse of the message altogether. They just began to repeat the world back to the world, but with kind of a Christian veneer over top.
And so, what does that look like today? That all makes sense to me, right? Um, but help me translate this to the political sphere, because I think people could say, oh, okay, I get it. Like we tone down the gospel to make it relevant, but that sounds like something we do in church. Help me see how we do that in politics.
I have no, no specific examples coming to mind right now. Um,
Well, does this relate? Let me ask it this way: does this relate back to that idea of we're willing to do anything to get a seat at the table, right? And that's not, because to me that idea of getting a seat at the political cultural table is different than trying to get people into the church, right? So what this might look like is, hey, let's stop doing communion because that takes up too much time in the service, or let's stop doing the time of confession in the liturgy because that makes it feel weird for people who are seekers. Like let's let's
right.
replace bread and wine with coffee and donuts. Let's replace incense with a light show. Whatever you've got there, right? Like those kind of typical.
Sure, sure.
I mean, they've become kind of tropes, but for a good reason. I can see that in the
Yeah.
church world, but when it comes to politics, does this look? And in that is all oriented toward the end of kind of the religion being relevant so that people come into it and kind of join it. But if we were to transpose this to the political sphere, is the end in mind getting a seat at the table? And so if getting a seat at that table requires us to say, maybe get rid of certain distinctive Christian teachings on moral issues or any number of things, we say, you know what, like, it's worth it for me. We'll cut that one from the agenda. Is that what this could look like?
Yeah, yeah, that's very helpful actually. So uh, here's an example. Um, uh, when President Trump, I may not have the details right, and if I don't, I'm sure I'll be corrected in the comments later. But when President Trump, while he was still a candidate, removed the pro-life plank from the Republican platform. On the one hand, I get it. In actual practice, the Republican Party is not a pro-life party. Fair enough. Um, but he removed it for his own reasons to make the party more palatable to other people and okay. Um, there was not a peep from his running mate, even though he was Catholic, right? And it's politically expedient not to criticize your boss. Now, in fairness to Vice President Vance, he did go on to participate in the March for Life, and I don't doubt his convictions. But I wondered about that. Um, when years ago, during the first Trump run, when Russell Moore said something like, you know, our parents would be shocked that we're being urged to vote for a thrice married strip club owner as the Christian approved candidate. Um, I think he's right. Um, and and the point is not that evangelicals shouldn't have voted for whomever for President Trump. That's not what I'm saying. The the point is, why were so many public evangelicals not saying, for example, this is a deeply flawed candidate, but the policies he's espousing are worth supporting for X, Y, and Z reasons. And so, you know, make your decision seriously. But instead, it's become kind of an all or nothing game. Like we have to ignore. I mean, one that really bugs me on across the political spectrum is the way profanity has become accepted political discourse as a way of showing your deep emotion. Uh, why can't a public Christian say, uh, well, that's just coarse language. You shouldn't be saying that. But that's it's those kinds of things. I don't know if that makes sense or not. Um,
I think
but
it
we're
completely makes sense.
yeah.
No, I'm sorry. Continue.
Oh, my dog derailed my train of thought there. Uh, good luck editing later. Um, so it's that kind of it's that kind of thing. Like if you're going to support candidate Trump, now President Trump, you have to support all the way. You can't say, "Oh, I like A, B, and C, but I'm really not sure about D, and F drives me crazy. I don't get that at all." You have to, the tribes are so fixed that you have to be all in one way or the other. To go to the other side, right? I had I mean, it's a peculiarly American sign, but I had people I know put it up in their on their lawns here in Canada. This house believes in science. This house knows that love is love, and they're all slogans that allow for no nuance, right? Of, of course, I believe in science, but when you actually drill into what that means, it means nothing except uh, you'd better be on my team. And if you're not, and then we're off to the races with the other heresies, right? So that's the kind of thing that I worry about, and that you have to be all in. You can't you can't pick and choose. And it might be that as a Canadian where evangelicals really are politically homeless, uh, we might be able to speak into the American situation a bit easier. The three major political parties, two of them have written into their platforms that you cannot be a member of that party and hold traditional Christian moral views. And the third party, the Conservative Party, has said you can hold them as long as you're quiet about them. you know so evangelicals and serious Catholics, and for that matter serious Jews and Muslims, are in many ways not represented in any of the three major political parties. And so in one way or other, that's kind of sad, because it might seem that our relevance is diminished, but in other ways it gives us the freedom to just nail our colors to the mast, and uh, we can speak a bit more freely because we know we're already on the outside. Um,
Yeah.
am I getting to an answer to
No,
your question there?
absolutely you are. Yeah, that was fantastic. And I think it points us back to this kind of totalizing nature that politics have taken on, especially in the US, where the inability to criticize someone on kind of just standard, straightforward Christian grounds points to me to this idea that politics has usurped religion in this way. And I totally get people saying like, "Hey, just because someone's imperfect doesn't mean you can't vote for them." Like, I mean, sure, yeah. If someone had to be perfect, none of us would vote. But I think it misses the point of the concern here. That is, why must we silence any criticisms? Is because it seems to be the case that people have taken on this view of like the ultimate thing is making sure that this party, platform, whatever, this candidate wins, and so it is. It is bad, it is wrong to point out any flaws because that could mean we lose ground. It's like, wait, like lose ground in which battle? Like, what's the ultimate battle we're fighting here? Because I think sometimes we're we're missing the big story, and I think that's what your book points out really well. One thing I wanted to get to before we closed is the sixth heresy, or yeah, sixth heresy that you treat, or chapter six, fifth heresy, which is Donatism, and I really like
Mhm.
this idea of uh, avoiding this sense, which I think we were just getting at, of like you're either right or you're evil. Like there's this kind of like bifurcation here. But talk about Donatism a little bit.
Uh, in terms of its contemporary manifestation, or what it looked like originally, or both?
I guess briefly
Just to
what it
give you a
looked
sense of
like.
where it took off.
Yeah, yeah. So for those who aren't familiar, maybe just kind of like a really brief what was Donatism, which will help us understand why we're applying it here, because otherwise the term might just uh,
Okay.
feel odd to someone. So yeah, good question.
So, Donatism is birthed in the persecutions of the early church in North Africa, uh, which, generally speaking, the first 3 centuries of Christian faith, persecutions tended to be local, tended to be sporadic, and the severity varied depended on what region you were in. Um, Generally speaking, in North Africa, what today would be Algeria, I guess, um, the persecutions tended to be longer and tended to be more severe. And as a result, the Christians who came through those had a very uh, charged reaction to the pastoral question of what to do with Christian believers and especially Christian leaders who had lapsed under persecution, and then when the persecution was over, wanted to come back to church and even to be restored to leadership in church. And the particularities were fought between the Donatists on one side and Saint Augustine on the other, uh, over the efficacy of the sacraments. But we don't need to go into those details. I talk a little bit more about that in the book. But the issue is, what is the nature of the church's holiness? And the problem with the Donatists was in their, I think, right insistence that Christian believers should be holy, and should not lapse under persecution. The problem is that uh, they lost sight of the gospel being a message of mercy more than a message of moral rigor. And as a result, it was very easy for them to say, the church has to be holy, uh, and if your holiness doesn't rise to our standard, then you're bad. Then you're outside the church. Then you're not a part of us. And that led to the fracturing of the church in North Africa. Um, and so Donatism becomes kind of a shorthand way of reflecting on the nature of our own discourse, where we cannot abide disagreement on political issues. We cannot say to the person who voted for the other candidate or the other party, um, you're just mistaken, let's go get ice cream. We have to say, you're bad and I don't want anything to do with you. Um, in my own ministry here, up here in Canada, where that has borne a lot of really bad fruit for many pastors, not just me, but me. My own congregation is over COVID. Um, uh, I think you could ask just about any active pastor, and they will tell you that they're dealing with situations within families, situations within their congregations where relationships have fractured over the rightness or wrongness of vaccines, which I don't want to litigate here today. I'm holding that up as an example of, you know, there's a penultimate issue, a secondary issue in terms of the gospel that has become so toxic that to disagree with someone on it is for that the other person to not just be mistaken but to be evil, to be a threat, um, that must be avoided at all costs. And it seems to me that if we're believers in Jesus, this is precisely the kind of dividing belief that he has broken down the wall of by the blood of his cross. And so if you're maintaining that division and you're both claiming to be followers of Jesus, there's something wrong there. Like something's gone off the rails if you can't treat this important but secondary issue as secondary and the reconciling work of Jesus as primary, then we've got some repenting to do. And the rightness or wrongness or efficacy of vaccines or the science thereof really is secondary to that reconciling work that needs to happen.
Indeed. This is one of those areas where I recognize anytime I find myself saying, I don't understand how someone could think X, Y, or Z. It's a reflection of a problem in me insofar as it's a lack of understanding, right? Like that's literally baked into the terminology. I don't understand, which is a deficiency at some level, at least of kind of cognitive um, reconciling with an idea. And so I recognize that I don't fully understand the other side on this, but I do find myself just bewildered how thoroughly this has divided the church. And I'm sure people could give me lengthy comments about why this should have divided the church and why this is such an important issue. Frankly, like I just struggle to see it. But I guess with that kind of caveat aside, like as a pastor who's lived through this, what what what's the remedy, right? Because I know so many pastors have felt so much burnout in this, and so many congregations have just been completely torn apart by things like masks or vaccines. And those are just kind of the tip of the iceberg. There's all types of other issues, but
Yeah.
it seems kind of bewildering to me that something like that would happen, but it has happened. And that's the world we live in. And we don't get to kind of rewind the clock on COVID and all of the kind of damage that has happened in churches because of that. And so, how do we help people see, to borrow the language of my friend Gavin Ortland, like what are the right hills to die on here, right? Like, how do we figure out what are the issues that are worth, causing great scandal in the church, and what is just really secondary? Like, where are we kind of really missing the forest for the trees? What do you do? Because you've had to lead through this. So how do you help people try to make sense of what's most important?
Yeah. And we have a long way to go. First of all, I'm not holding myself up, certainly as a pastor who's figured out how to do this. Um, I really do think that it is first and foremost a spiritual matter, and that means it requires a spiritual remedy. Um, it's reconciliation is not going to be achieved by doubling down on who in the end is shown to be right. And it may be in that way boy, I'm going to get myself in trouble for saying this, but it may be in that way that getting churches reconciled after COVID is going to look a lot like getting churches reconciled after the Civil War in the States. Um, Not in terms of the severity of the issue. I'm not equating COVID with the Civil War, but you had there were churches who were not just supportive of the Confederacy, but were pro slavery. There were churches that were abolitionists. There were churches like the Episcopalian Church, which said, we straddled both sides of the border, so we're not going to say anything until this is over. Uh, well, when it ended, in some way, within those denominations, some kind of reconciliation for the sake of the gospel had to happen. Uh, and it might be, it's something like that might need to happen post COVID for us now. The there's no we're not going to get to reconciling if we're continually going to relitigate the validity of masks or vaccines or lockdowns or whatever. Those times are over. Now we need to look at how we spoke to each other about those issues at that time and ask ourselves whether, um, to be honest, we were imitating Christ in the patterns of our speech. And if the answer is no, then we need to say sorry to God. We need to say sorry to the people we spoke to, and we need to ask for their forgiveness. And when forgiveness is sought from us, we need to be reckless in giving it because that's the way God forgives us. Um, I think anyway. And that's the main concern of my book is ultimately not political. Like we've been talking about politics all the way along, but the main concern has not been political. It's spiritual, right? We have a collectively, I think, and I've certainly been infected by it, but we have a spiritual contagion active that tempts us to make politics the most important thing. And the gospel remedy always to spiritual contagion is repentance and faith and reliance upon grace.
Tim, I can't think of a better place to wrap up than there. Thank you so much for this conversation. This has been an absolute joy. I'll have a link to your book in the description down below. But once again, thanks for your time and thanks for being here today.
You're very, very welcome. It's a pleasure to join you.